Amelia Thorne believed her world was a fortress, its walls built of her husband's inherited money and her own impeccable social standing. She believed her son Leo was a minor asset to be polished for public display, and her new husband Julian was a disappointing acquisition, a man whose professional star had inexplicably fallen, leaving him a dependent orbiting her brilliant son. She believed with the unshakable faith of the truly arrogant that she was untouchable. Within 24 hours, she would learn that her fortress was a house of cards, built on a foundation of lies she herself had laid, and a single gust of truth was about to bring it all down. What she didn't know was that the man she openly despised, the quiet, unassuming man she had reduced to a household fixture, was not a fallen star at all. He was a silent giant, and he was about to stand up. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? That sting of being misjudged, dismissed, or looked down upon. It's a universal feeling, and it's what makes stories of vindication so deeply satisfying. Before we dive into Julian's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you find yourself rooting for the underdog, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales of justice and quiet strength. Now, let us return to the moment the first crack appeared in Amelia's perfect world. The incident itself was born of such casual cruelty that it was almost mundane. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the air thick with the cloying scent of the lilies Amelia insisted on having delivered twice a week. 7-year-old Leo, a boy with his father's quiet eyes and a spirit that was slowly being eroded, had spilled a glass of milk. It was an accident, a simple slip of a small hand. The white liquid pooled on the polished oak of the dining table, a stark, messy violation of the room's sterile perfection. Amelia, who had been scrolling through her phone, her lips pursed in a familiar expression of faint disapproval, looked up. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. Her cruelty was a cold, precise instrument, not a blunt weapon. "Julian," she called, her voice carrying a silken edge of command. "Your son has made a mess." Julian emerged from his small home office, a room that was once a pantry. Since he'd lost his job at the prestigious architectural firm 6 months ago, this small, windowless space had become his domain. He saw the spilled milk, the fear in Leo's wide eyes, and the rigid set of Amelia's jaw. "It's all right, buddy," Julian said softly, his voice a low counterpoint to the room's tension. He grabbed a cloth from the kitchen. "Accidents happen." "Not in this house," Amelia stated, placing her phone face down on the table. "Not through carelessness. He needs to learn a lesson about wastefulness." Leo's lower lip began to tremble. "I'm sorry, Mommy." Amelia ignored him, her gaze fixed on Julian. "He's your son, Julian. Your responsibility. He seems to be inheriting your clumsiness, your lack of finesse." The insult was meant to land, and it did, but Julian's face remained a placid mask. He had spent the last 6 months perfecting this mask. It was his armor. He simply began to wipe up the milk, the circular motions of his hand calm and methodical. "He's a child, Amelia. He spilled some milk. And now he will learn not to," she said. She stood, a tall, elegant figure in a cream-colored cashmere sweater. She walked to the kitchen and returned not with a glass, but with a small ceramic bowl belonging to Persephone, her prize-winning Persian cat. The cat watched from its plush bed, a silent, furry monarch. Amelia placed the cat's bowl on the floor. It still had a few stray kibble crumbs in it. She then took the carton of milk from the refrigerator and poured a small amount into the bowl. The sound of the milk hitting the ceramic was unnaturally loud in the silent room. "There," she said, her voice bright with a terrifying kind of logic. "If he is going to spill his drink like an animal, he can drink from the floor like one. Finish your milk, Leo." Leo stared at the bowl on the floor, his face a crumpled mess of confusion and horror. Tears began to stream silently down his cheeks. He looked at his father, his eyes pleading. Julian froze. Every cell in his body screamed at him to snatch the bowl, to throw it against the wall, to grab his son and walk out the door forever. But his mind, a place of cold, calculated strategy, held him in check. Not yet. Not like this. Patience. The plan is in motion. Stick to the plan. He knelt beside his son. Leo, he said, his voice thick with a control that cost him almost everything. Look at me. Leo turned his tear-streaked face to his father. You don't have to do this, Julian whispered, his back to Amelia. But Mommy said, I know what she said, Julian murmured. He could feel Amelia's gaze on his back, cold and triumphant. She was testing him. She was demonstrating his powerlessness, his irrelevance in her world. This was the latest in a long, carefully documented series of humiliations. He stood up, turning to face her. His face was still calm, but something in his eyes had changed. It was a subtle shift, a hardening, like ice forming on a still lake. He's not doing it, Amelia. Amelia raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Excuse me? You heard me. This is monstrous. It's not a lesson, it's abuse. The word hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Amelia laughed, a short, brittle sound. Oh, Julian, don't be so dramatic. And don't you dare use a word like abuse in my house. You, the unemployed architect living off my generosity, are going to lecture me on parenting? You have no say here. Leo will do as I tell him. Julian walked over to Leo and gently lifted him into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's neck, his small body shaking with sobs. Julian held him tightly, a silent promise of protection that felt, in that moment, like a lie. This is not your house, Amelia, he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. It was a statement of fact, but she heard it as a pathetic challenge. Isn't it? She scoffed. My name is on the deed. My money paid for the ridiculous renovations you couldn't even oversee properly. Everything in this house, including the very clothes on your back, is mine. You are a guest here, Julian. A guest who has long overstayed his welcome. Now put my son down and let him learn his lesson. Julian simply stood there, holding his son, absorbing the venom. He looked from his wife's smug, beautiful face to the milk in the cat's bowl on the floor. And in that moment, he felt a profound and chilling certainty. He was doing the right thing. The plan, the meticulous, patient, and devastating plan he had set in motion months ago, was not just about justice anymore. It was about salvation. He held the future in his arms, and he would burn down the whole world to keep it safe. He turned and carried Leo back to the small office, closing the door behind him, leaving Amelia standing alone in her perfect room, the victor of a battle she didn't realize had just cost her the war. The weeks that followed the cat bowl incident were a masterclass in controlled observation. Julian became a ghost in his own home, his presence tolerated but largely ignored. He was the silent witness to Amelia's reign, documenting every slight, every casual act of cruelty, not with anger, but with the dispassionate precision of an architect drawing up blueprints. His journal, a simple black moleskin notebook, became a ledger of grievances, its pages filled with his neat, angular script. October 14th, A told L his drawing of a rocket ship was unimaginative and threw it away while he was watching. L cried in his room for an hour. I retrieved the drawing from the trash after they went to bed. It's now in the portfolio. October 19th, A's mother Eleanor was over for lunch. L was excited to show her the Lego castle he'd spent all morning building. A told him not to bother Nona with his childish clutter. Eleanor just smiled and changed the subject to the new acquisitions at the art gallery. She saw the look on his face. She saw it, and she did nothing. Eleanor's complicity was a special kind of poison. She was a woman who had mistaken passivity for grace. She would sit in the cavernous living room, a teacup poised delicately in her manicured hand, and watch as her daughter dismantled Julian's dignity piece by piece. She would witness Amelia's sharp, cutting remarks to Leo and offer only a tight, meaningless smile. She was a silent enabler, her silence a form of validation that amplified Amelia's worst tendencies. One Saturday, Eleanor was visiting when Julian was attempting to fix a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet. It was a simple task, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying a phone call with his lawyer from the previous day. The screwdriver slipped, scratching the custom-painted finish. Amelia, who had been describing a charity gala to her mother, stopped mid-sentence. "My God, Julian, can you do nothing right? That's a $3,000 cabinet you've just defaced." "It's a tiny scratch, Amelia. I can fix it," he said, his voice even. "Fix it? You?" She let out a short, derisive laugh. "You couldn't even fix your own career. Leave it. I'll have a professional come on Monday. Please just go somewhere else. Your incompetence is giving me a headache." Julian looked at Eleanor, hoping for, if not support, at least a flicker of disapproval at her daughter's venom. He received nothing. Eleanor simply took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes avoiding his. She was an accessory to the cruelty, as silent and ornamental as the porcelain shepherdess on the mantelpiece. He quietly put the screwdriver away and retreated to his office. He closed the door and sat at his small desk. He didn't seethe. He didn't rage. Instead, he pulled a worn leather portfolio from a locked drawer. It was old and unassuming, the kind of thing a recent graduate might carry, but inside it held the architecture of his new life. He opened it. On top was Leo's drawing of the rocket ship, carefully smoothed out. Beneath it were financial statements, bank records, and a single, folded document. It was the purchase agreement for a penthouse apartment overlooking the city park, bought 3 months ago, in his name only. Beneath that was a thick stack of printed emails and text messages, a timeline of Amelia's escalating disdain. And at the very bottom, a copy of the Articles of Incorporation for a small, anonymous LLC that now held the entirety of the 9-figure sum he'd received from the sale of his architectural firm. A sale he had told Amelia was simply him being laid off due to restructuring. He touched the smooth, cool paper of the penthouse deed. This was his symbolic object, the tangible proof of his secret. It was the foundation of the life he was building for himself and his son, a life far away from the stifling perfection of this house. Amelia believed he was a failure, a man adrift. The truth was he had never been more anchored, more purposeful. He was not adrift. He was in a holding pattern, waiting for the precise moment to land. Every condescending remark from Amelia, every dismissive glance from Eleanor, every tear Leo shed in secret, they were not just wounds. They were bricks. And Julian was patiently, methodically building a wall of his own. Not a fortress like Amelia's, built to keep the world out, but a retaining wall, designed to hold back the flood of his own anger until the time was right. His patience was a form of power Amelia couldn't comprehend. She saw his quietness as weakness, his stillness as defeat. She had no idea that she was living in a meticulously designed structure, and the architect was about to perform a controlled demolition. He closed the portfolio, locked it away, and the calm mask slipped back into place. The ghost returned to haunting the halls, watching, waiting, and documenting. The weight of the portfolio in the drawer was a silent comfort, a promise that the foundations of their current reality were about to be systematically and irrevocably removed. The escalation came, as it often did, under the guise of a social event. Amelia loved to entertain. Her parties were exercises in status, carefully curated guest lists of the city's wealthy and influential. To her, Julian had become a social liability, but his presence was a necessary prop to maintain the illusion of a stable, if slightly lopsided, marriage. She had invited her closest circle for an intimate dinner, the Jacksons, a banking heir and his perpetually unimpressed wife, and the Vances, a property developer and his much younger, surgically enhanced partner. It was a performance, and Julian was the unwilling stagehand. He was instructed to stay in the background, to refill wine glasses, and to speak only when spoken to. He complied with a serenity that Amelia found intensely irritating. Dinner was served on the patio, under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights. The conversation was a predictable tapestry of summering in the Hamptons, the difficulty of finding good staff, and the outrageous cost of private school tuition. Julian listened, a faint, polite smile on his face, as if watching a play whose ending he already knew. "Amelia, this house is just divine," said Mrs. Jackson, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "You have such an eye for detail." "Thank you, Caroline," Amelia beamed, accepting the compliment as her due. "I had a vision. Of course, bringing it to life was a challenge." She cast a deliberate, theatrical glance toward Julian, who was standing near the bar, ostensibly checking the ice bucket. "How so?" asked Mr. Vance, the developer, intrigued. "Well," Amelia began, leaning in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "One assumes when one marries an architect, one is getting a certain level of expertise. Someone to oversee the project, to manage the details." She sighed, a perfect little puff of disappointment. "Unfortunately, Julian's firm let him go right in the middle of the renovation. A real shame. I suppose they just didn't have room for his particular style anymore." The implication was clear and brutal. Julian wasn't just unemployed, he was obsolete, a failure. Mr. Vance, a man whose entire identity was built on success, looked at Julian with a new, pitying curiosity. "Tough market out there, I hear. What was your firm again?" Before Julian could answer, Amelia cut in smoothly. "Oh, it was a small, boutique firm. You wouldn't have heard of it. They did some interesting work, I suppose, but it was all very academic, not grounded in the real world of commerce." Julian felt the eyes of the guests on him. He saw not malice, but a mixture of pity and condescension. In their world, professional failure was a terminal diagnosis. He was no longer a peer, he was a cautionary tale. He simply nodded slightly, as if agreeing with his wife's assessment. His calm was a mirror, reflecting their judgment back at them, but they were too self-absorbed to see it. He picked up a bottle of chilled Sancerre. "More wine, Caroline?" he asked, his voice steady. Later, as the guests were leaving, their goodbyes to Julian were noticeably cooler, more perfunctory. He was no longer Mr. Amelia Thorne. He was Amelia Thorne's charity case. Once the door closed on the last guest, Amelia turned to him, her eyes glittering with triumph. "Well, that went well, I think." "They certainly seemed to enjoy themselves," Julian replied, beginning to clear the glasses from the table. "Don't be obtuse, Julian. You know what I mean. It's important for our friends to understand the situation." "The situation being my professional and personal failure?" he asked, his hand still. He looked directly at her. "If you want to call it that," she said with a shrug. "I prefer to think of it as a recalibration of our dynamic. I am the primary earner now. I am the one who maintains this lifestyle. It's only fair that people understand your new role." "And what is my new role?" "You're Leo's father, and my husband. Be content with that. It's more than many men in your position have." Her confidence was absolute, a towering edifice. She truly believed she had won, that she had successfully redefined him in the eyes of the world and, more importantly, in his own eyes. That night, Julian didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of his small office, the door closed. He didn't look at the portfolio. He didn't need to. The plans were etched in his mind. He made 2 quiet phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, confirming the final details for the custody filing. The second was to the head of a private security firm. "Yes, I'll need 2 of your best men. Discreet, professional. They need to be at this address at 8 a.m. on Friday," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They will be there to ensure a peaceful transition. No, I don't anticipate trouble, but I believe in being prepared." He was preparing not for a fight, but for a surrender. Amelia's surrender. She had spent months tearing down his reputation, brick by brick. She had no idea that he had been secretly building a new world for his son, a world she would have no part in. As he hung up the phone, he felt a profound sense of melancholy. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to be an architect of ruin, but she had left him no choice. The demolition was scheduled. The quiet preparation was complete. All that was left was the final, inevitable collapse. The quiet before the storm arrived 2 days later, on a Thursday evening. It was a perfectly ordinary night, which made the tension thrumming beneath its surface all the more unbearable. Rain lashed against the large picture windows of the dining room, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass. Inside, the only sounds were the soft clinking of silver on porcelain and the strained, methodical chewing. Amelia, Julian, and Leo sat at the long oak table. A single, unscented candle flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. Leo was pushing a piece of roasted chicken around his plate, his head bowed. Amelia was staring at Julian, a look of profound irritation on her face. She had spent the afternoon on the phone with her bank and had discovered an anomaly. A routine transfer to their joint account had been missed. "The household account is lower than it should be, Julian," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was flat. "The automatic transfer from the trust didn't come through." Julian had been managing the trust, a fiction he had created to explain the steady but limited flow of funds he allowed her access to. It was a carefully constructed allowance, designed to maintain her lifestyle without giving her access to the vast ocean of his actual wealth. He had that morning instructed his bank to halt all transfers. "I'm aware," he said, placing his fork and knife neatly together on his plate. "I stopped it." Amelia's eyes widened slightly. It was the first time he had ever done something financial without her instruction. It was a small act of rebellion, but to her, it was seismic. "You did what? Why? On whose authority?" "On my authority," he said simply. He met her gaze across the flickering candlelight. His face was calm, his eyes unreadable. She let out a breathy, incredulous laugh. "Your authority? Julian, you have no authority. The money, the trust, it's all from my family, managed for our benefit. You have no right to interfere." It was the lie she had told herself so many times she now believed it completely. The money was his, the trust was a fabrication, and her family's wealth was a pale shadow compared to the fortune he had amassed and hidden. "Things are changing, Amelia," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "The only thing that's changing," she retorted, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss, "is my patience for this charade, this pathetic attempt to reassert some long-lost masculinity. You are nothing, Julian, a kept man. You live in my house, you eat my food, you spend my money. You will turn that transfer back on tomorrow morning, or I swear to God, I will call my lawyer and have you thrown out of here with nothing but the cheap suit on your back." It was the culmination of everything. All the insults, all the humiliations, distilled into one final, devastating declaration of her perceived power and his supposed worthlessness. She sat back, her chest rising and falling, confident that she had delivered the final, killing blow. She had put him back in his box. Leo, who had been frozen during the exchange, began to cry softly. "Please don't fight," he whispered. Julian's gaze softened as he looked at his son. He reached a hand across the table, but not toward Amelia. He gently touched Leo's arm. "It's okay, buddy. Everything is going to be okay now." He then looked back at his wife. The placid mask was gone. In its place was not anger, but a profound, almost sorrowful clarity. "Everything has a foundation, Amelia," he said, his voice still quiet, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. "A house, a career, a relationship. It's the most important part of any structure. Without a strong foundation, everything built on top of it is just waiting to collapse." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. You should have paid more attention to what your foundation was built on. She stared at him, confused and unsettled. The threat had not landed as she'd expected. His calm was unnerving. It wasn't the quiet of a defeated man. It was the quiet of a man holding all the cards. She opened her mouth to deliver another cutting remark, to shatter his strange composure, but before she could speak, the doorbell rang. The sound, a cheerful, melodic chime, was an alien intrusion into the suffocating atmosphere of the room. It rang again, insistent. "Who on earth could that be in this weather?" Amelia snapped, irritated. She looked at Julian. "Well, are you going to get it? Or is that also beneath you now?" Julian didn't move. He simply looked at the door, then back at her. A flicker of something that looked almost like pity crossed his face. "I think," he said softly, "it's for you." The doorbell rang for a third time, sharp and decisive, signaling the end of the quiet and the arrival of the storm. Amelia threw her napkin onto the table in a gesture of pure exasperation. "Useless," she muttered, pushing her chair back with a grating screech. She strode to the door, her heels clicking in angry rhythm on the marble floor of the foyer. She was already composing a sharp dismissal for whatever salesperson or neighborhood canvasser was foolish enough to be out on a night like this. She pulled the heavy oak door open, a frosty, "What do you want?" already on her lips. But the words died there. Standing on the covered porch, illuminated by the warm glow of the entryway lights, were two people. A woman with a kind but serious face, holding a leather-bound clipboard, and a tall, impassive man standing slightly behind her. Rain dripped from the edge of the portico behind them, a curtain of silver separating them from the dark, churning night. "Amelia Thorne?" the woman asked. Her voice was calm and professional, entirely unperturbed by the weather or by Amelia's hostile posture. "Yes," Amelia said, her tone clipped. "And you are?" "My name is Sarah Evans. I'm with the Department of Child and Family Services," the woman said, holding up an identification badge. The man behind her remained silent, his presence a solid, unmoving statement. "May we come in? We've received a report we need to discuss with you and your husband." Amelia's mind raced. Child and Family Services? It made no sense. It was absurd. She glanced back toward the dining room, where Julian was now standing, holding Leo's hand. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. A cold knot of suspicion began to form in her stomach. "A report? About what?" she asked, her voice a little too sharp. "It concerns the welfare of your son, Leo," Ms. Evans said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We are obligated to investigate all such reports. It would be best if we could speak inside." Amelia's first instinct was to slam the door. This was an invasion, a preposterous intrusion into her private life. But the presence of the silent man behind Miss Evans and the unshakable professionalism in the woman's eyes gave her pause. This was not something she could dismiss with a wave of her hand. "This is ridiculous," Amelia said, stepping back to let them in, but making it clear it was under protest. "Utterly ridiculous. My son is perfectly fine. Who made this report? Was it the school? Some overzealous teacher?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose the source of the report, Mrs. Thorne," Miss Evans replied as she stepped into the foyer, her practical shoes silent on the polished marble. "Our only concern is for the child." Julian walked out to meet them, with Leo now hiding slightly behind his legs. "Miss Evans," Julian said with a calm nod, "thank you for coming." Amelia's head whipped around. "You knew about this?" she accused, her voice rising. "Julian, did you do this? Is this your pathetic idea of revenge?" "My only concern is for Leo," Julian said, echoing the social worker's words. The phrase, so simple and reasonable, was a declaration of war. Miss Evans looked from Amelia's furious face to Julian's stoic one, then down at the small boy peering out from behind his father's legs. "Perhaps we could all sit down in the living room," she suggested, her voice a gentle but firm guide in the rising tide of conflict. They moved into the living room, a space Amelia had designed to be featured in magazines. It was all cream and gold, with vast sofas and abstract art. It was a room designed for impressing, not for living. Tonight, its sterile perfection felt like a courtroom. Amelia sat on the edge of a silk sofa, perched like a bird of prey ready to strike. Julian took an armchair opposite her, pulling Leo onto his lap. The boy burrowed into his father's chest, seeking refuge. Ms. Evans took the other armchair, placing her clipboard on the glass coffee table between them. "Mrs. Thorne," Ms. Evans began, her tone even and methodical. "The report we received contains allegations of emotional abuse and neglect. Specifically, it mentions incidents of humiliation used as a form of discipline." Amelia let out a sound that was half scoff, half gasp. "That is an outrageous lie. I love my son. I provide him with everything he could ever want. Look at this house. Does this look like the home of a neglected child?" "A child's welfare isn't measured by the square footage of their home, Mrs. Thorne," Miss Evans said coolly. "The report mentioned a specific incident involving a spilled glass of milk and a pet's food bowl." The color drained from Amelia's face. Her eyes darted to Julian. His expression was serene. He knew. Of course he knew. He had been there. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a ball of ice. "It was a lesson," Amelia said, her voice strained. "A simple lesson about being wasteful. The boy is clumsy. He needs to learn. And you felt that forcing him to drink from a cat's bowl on the floor was an appropriate way to teach that lesson?" Ms. Evans asked, her question clean and sharp as a scalpel. It was a moment of frustration. It was a mistake," Amelia stammered, backtracking. It wasn't what it sounds like. Julian, tell her it was just a silly misunderstanding." She looked at her husband, her eyes for the first time holding not contempt, but a desperate plea. She was offering him a lifeline, a chance to fall back into line and protect their unified front. She expected him to take it. She believed, even now, that he was weak, that he would bend to her will. Julian looked at her for a long moment. He adjusted Leo slightly in his lap, stroking his hair. Then he turned his calm, steady gaze to Ms. Evans. "It was exactly what it sounds like," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "And it wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of a pattern." The revelation began not with a shout, but with the quiet click of a briefcase latch. While Amelia was still reeling from Julian's betrayal, he leaned down and retrieved the worn leather portfolio he had placed beside his chair. He set it on the coffee table next to Ms. Evans's clipboard. It looked insignificant, almost pathetic, next to the room's opulent decor. "A pattern?" Amelia sputtered, her voice rising with panicked indignation. "What pattern? You're making this up. You're a vindictive, pathetic man, and you are poisoning my son against me." Julian ignored her. He looked at Ms. Evans. "The incident with the cat bowl was on October 12th. I have a photo." He opened the portfolio and slid a glossy 4x6 photograph across the table. It was a picture of the small ceramic bowl on the polished oak floor, a puddle of white milk inside it. It was clinical, damning, and irrefutable. Miss Evans picked it up, her expression unreadable. "As I said," Julian continued, his voice as calm and measured as a university lecturer's, "it's a pattern." He began to pull more items from the portfolio, laying them out like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "This," he said, pushing a crumpled but carefully smoothed piece of paper forward, "is a drawing my son made. Amelia threw it in the trash in front of him because she found it unimaginative. This," he added, producing a small digital voice recorder, "is a recording of a conversation from 3 nights ago, where Mrs. Thorne threatens to have me thrown out with nothing but the cheap suit on my back after I questioned her authority." He pressed play. Amelia's voice, sharp and venomous, filled the silent room. "You are nothing, Julian. A kept man. You live in my house. You eat my food. You spend my money." Amelia stared at the recorder as if it were a snake. "You recorded me? In my own home?" For Leo's protection, Julian said simply, stopping the playback. He then produced the black moleskin notebook. And this is a journal I have kept for the past 6 months, documenting every incident of verbal abuse, emotional manipulation, and neglect. Every insult, every threat, every time our son was made to feel worthless for not living up to her impossible standards. It's all there. Dates, times, witnesses. He pushed the journal towards Ms. Evans. Ms. Evans opened the journal, her eyes scanning the neat, meticulous entries. Amelia was white as a sheet, her mind struggling to process the sheer, calculated breadth of Julian's betrayal. She had seen him as a piece of furniture, and all the while, the furniture had been taking notes. "This is insane," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is all circumstantial. It's my word against his. He's an unemployed, bitter man trying to ruin me." She turned to Ms. Evans, attempting to muster some of her old authority. "I'll have you know my family is very well respected in this city. My lawyer will have a field day with this fantasy." Julian listened patiently. When she was finished, he delivered the quiet bomb. "You're right about one thing, Amelia," he said softly. "It is about money, but you have the dynamic reversed." He reached back into the portfolio and pulled out the final set of documents. He fanned them out on the table. They were dense with official letterheads and financial figures. "I wasn't laid off 6 months ago," he stated, his voice devoid of any triumph, simply stating a fact. "I sold my firm, a firm you called small and boutique. I sold it to a multinational conglomerate for a sum that has 9 figures. I am not unemployed, Amelia. I am retired. A very, very wealthy retired man." The air left the room. Amelia stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. Miss Evans paused her reading of the journal and looked up, her professional composure momentarily flickering with surprise. "And this house," Julian continued, tapping one of the documents, "this is not your house. I bought it, with my own money before we were married. Your name was added to the deed as a courtesy, a gesture of goodwill which I am now formally rescinding. The trust that you thought was your family's money was a separate account I set up to manage household expenses, a small fraction of my actual worth, an allowance, if you will. And as of this morning, you no longer have access to it." He let the information settle. The beautiful, expensive room suddenly felt like a stage set whose backdrop had just collapsed, revealing the dingy brick wall behind it. Amelia's entire identity, the wealthy benefactor, the society queen, the powerful matriarch, was built on a foundation of his money, a foundation he had just pulled out from under her. "No," she whispered. It was a sound of pure, uncomprehending denial. "You're lying." "Your lawyer is welcome to verify the paperwork," Julian said calmly. "It's all quite legal and quite final. I have been planning this for a very long time. I was just waiting for you to provide me with enough evidence to ensure that when I leave, I'm taking our son with me. And tonight, with Miss Evans as our witness, you have." He looked at the social worker. "My only goal here is to provide a safe, stable, and loving home for my son. I have the means, I have the evidence of abuse, and I have a 3-bedroom penthouse apartment waiting for us, fully furnished and ready to move into. We will be leaving in the morning." The statement landed, simple, devastating, final. Amelia's fortress had not just been breached, it had been revealed to be a prison she had built for herself. And the quiet, unassuming janitor she had tormented for months had just locked the door and walked away with the only key. The silence that followed Julian's revelation was a physical presence in the room. It was heavier than the silk curtains, more solid than the marble mantelpiece. Amelia stared at him, her face a mask of shattered disbelief. The world she had so carefully constructed, the hierarchy she had enforced with such casual cruelty, had been inverted in the space of 5 minutes. The master had become the dependent, and the servant had become the king. Her first reaction was not anger, but a desperate, flailing denial. "No, no, that's not possible," she stammered, her gaze darting from the financial documents on the table to Julian's calm face. The money, my father. Your father's portfolio is respectable, Amelia, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the sale of an internationally recognized architectural firm, Julian said, his voice gentle, almost pitying. You never once asked about the details of my work. You just assumed. You saw what you wanted to see, a man whose status was dependent on yours. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Her arrogance, her complete lack of curiosity about his life beyond how it served her own, had been her undoing. She had been so focused on her own reflection, she had never bothered to look at the man standing beside her. Her denial curdled into rage. "You deceitful bastard!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. She lunged across the coffee table, her hands reaching for him, for the papers, for anything to destroy. The silent man who had entered with Miss Evans moved with startling speed. He was not there as a threat, but as a de-escalator. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between Amelia and the table, a solid, immovable object. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, "please, sit down." Amelia recoiled as if she'd hit a wall. The sight of this stranger, this official presence in her home, enforcing a boundary against her, seemed to finally break through her hysteria. She collapsed back onto the sofa, her body racked with shuddering, tearless sobs. It was the sound of a queen realizing she was naked in the public square. Miss Evans had remained silent throughout the financial revelation, her focus never wavering from her primary purpose. She looked at Julian. "Your financial status is noted, Mr. Thorne. It confirms your ability to provide for the child. But my primary concern remains the evidence of emotional abuse." She gestured to the journal, the photo, the recorder. "This is a very thorough and disturbing record." She then turned her calm, assessing gaze on Amelia. "Mrs. Thorne, in light of this evidence and your husband's stated intention to leave with your son, my immediate responsibility is to ensure Leo's safety. Given the circumstances, I am recommending a temporary emergency order placing Leo in his father's sole care, effective immediately." "No!" Amelia cried out, the word raw with desperation. "You can't! He's my son!" "He is," Ms. Evans agreed, "and it is my job to protect him. Your actions, as documented here, have placed his emotional well-being at risk. You can contest this, of course. The courts will make the final determination. But for tonight, and for the immediate future, Leo will be staying with his father." Amelia looked at Julian, her expression transforming from rage to a desperate pleading horror. "Julian, please," she begged, her voice now a hoarse whisper. "Don't do this. We can talk about this. The money, it doesn't have to matter. We can fix this." It was the plea of a drowning woman, not for a life raft, but for the deed to the ocean. She still didn't understand. "The money was never the point, Amelia," Julian said, his voice laced with a deep sadness. "It was just the tool. This," he gestured to Leo, who was now asleep in his arms, exhausted by the emotional turmoil. "This is the point. You hurt him. You made him feel small and worthless to make yourself feel powerful. There's no fixing that. There's only moving forward." He stood up, holding his sleeping son carefully. "We'll be staying in the guest room tonight. My security team will be here at 8 a.m. to escort us. They will also be here to ensure you can pack your personal belongings peacefully." The mention of security, his security, was the final twist of the knife. He was not just leaving her, he was managing her exit from his property. Amelia stared at him, her face a ruin. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a vast, empty shock. She had lost everything: her husband, her son, her home, her wealth, her status. All of it, gone in an instant, because she had forced a 7-year-old boy to eat from a cat's bowl. The scales of justice, she was discovering, could be brutally, terrifyingly precise. Julian turned without another word and carried his son out of the room, leaving Amelia alone in the wreckage of her perfect life, the silent social worker and her stoic companion bearing witness to the fall. The next few days unfolded like a slow-motion demolition. True to his word, Julian had two discreet but unyielding security professionals arrive at 8 in the morning. They were not intimidating, they were simply firm, their presence a quiet declaration that the old rules no longer applied. Amelia, who had not slept, watched from an upstairs window as Julian loaded suitcases into a sleek black car she had never seen before. He moved with an unhurried efficiency, a man executing the final steps of a long-held plan. When he placed a sleeping Leo, wrapped in a blanket, into the back seat, something in Amelia finally broke. She ran down the stairs, her hair a mess, her expensive silk pajamas crumpled. "Julian!" she called out from the doorway. He paused and turned, his hand on the car door. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice small. "We have a place," he said. It was non-committal, a door quietly closing. "And me?" The question was a plea. "What am I supposed to do?" Julian looked at her for a long moment, not with hatred, but with a weary finality. "I've arranged for a month's rent to be paid on a furnished apartment in the city. A car will be here at noon to take you there. My lawyer will be in touch with yours to discuss the formal terms of the divorce and a temporary spousal support agreement. It will be adequate, enough to live on until you find your own way." It was more generous than she deserved, yet it felt like the cruelest of punishments. He was giving her just enough to survive, but not enough to maintain the life she had built her identity around. He was cutting her off, not just from his wealth, but from the world she knew. He got into the car without another word and drove away. Amelia stood in the doorway of the house that was no longer hers, watching the car disappear down the long, tree-lined drive. The security guard near the door cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, perhaps you'd like to start packing." The news of the separation, and more importantly, the dramatic reversal of fortunes, spread through Amelia's social circle like wildfire. The story, however, was not the one she would have told. Julian's lawyer, a master of public relations, had framed the narrative carefully. It was not a messy divorce, but the quiet dissolution of a marriage due to irreconcilable differences, coupled with the public announcement of Julian Thorne's recent, incredibly lucrative sale of his firm. Suddenly, Julian was not the failed architect. He was the city's most elusive and powerful new bachelor, a strategic genius who had played the long game. And Amelia? She was the woman who had inexplicably fumbled it all away. Her friends, the Jacksons and the Vances, the women with whom she had shared condescending whispers about Julian's failed career, were the first to abandon her. Their loyalty was to status, not to people. Caroline Jackson, who had once praised Amelia's divine house, now failed to return her calls. The invitations to galas and charity luncheons simply stopped coming. Amelia, stripped of her husband's wealth and status, was no longer a player. She was a ghost. Her mother, Eleanor, was her last resort. Amelia moved from the temporary apartment Julian had provided into her mother's spare room, a space filled with floral patterns and the scent of potpourri. It was a regression to a life she thought she had long since escaped. Eleanor, however, was facing her own crisis of conscience. Ms. Evans had interviewed her as well, asking direct, uncomfortable questions about what she had witnessed in her daughter's home. Eleanor had equivocated, offering vague non-answers. But the social worker's parting words had haunted her. "Silence in the face of cruelty is a form of participation, Mrs. Vance. You have a choice to make about what kind of grandmother you want to be." One afternoon, as Amelia was railing against Julian, calling him a monster, a snake, a manipulator, Eleanor finally broke her lifelong habit of passive agreement. "He's not a monster, Amelia," she said quietly, setting down her teacup with a small clatter. Amelia stopped mid-rant. "What did you say?" "I said, he's not a monster," Eleanor repeated, her voice gaining strength. "He is a father who was pushed to the absolute limit. I sat in your living room, Amelia, I saw how you treated him. I saw how you spoke to your own son. I saw you belittle that boy and I said nothing." Her voice cracked. "I am as much to blame for this as you are." "Blame? Mother, he deceived us all. He lied for months." "He hid his success." "You flaunted a success that wasn't even yours," Eleanor countered, her eyes filled with a sad clarity. "He built a secret life to protect his son. You built a public life to inflate your ego. Do you not see the difference?" It was the first time in Amelia's life her mother had ever truly stood up to her. For Amelia, it was the ultimate betrayal. For Eleanor, it was the first, painful step toward redemption. She knew that if she ever wanted to see her grandson again, it would not be through her daughter's influence, but through her own honesty. The next day, Eleanor called her lawyer. She was going to make a formal statement to Child and Family Services, telling them everything she had seen. She was choosing her grandson over her daughter's lies. Meanwhile, Julian and Leo were building a new life in the sky. Their penthouse was a world away from the oppressive grandeur of the old house. It was modern, bright, and filled with light, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling green of the city park. The walls were not filled with abstract art, but with Leo's drawings, including the rocket ship, now framed and hanging in the main hallway. They spent their days playing in the park, visiting museums, and simply talking. Julian was rediscovering his son, and Leo was discovering what it felt like to be unconditionally loved, to be praised for his imagination, to be allowed to be a child. The fear in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a bright spark of confidence. The foundation of their new life was solid, built not on money or status, but on a quiet, unbreakable bond of love and respect. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Julian's case was overwhelming. He had the evidence, the financial stability, and now a corroborating witness in his own mother-in-law. Eleanor's testimony was a devastating blow to Amelia's already non-existent defense. She detailed with painful honesty the culture of casual cruelty her daughter had fostered, her own failure to intervene, and the visible effect it had on Leo. Amelia's lawyer, a high-priced shark accustomed to aggressive tactics, quickly realized he had nothing to work with. Julian wasn't a vengeful ex-husband seeking to destroy his former wife. His requests were firm but reasonable. He sought full physical and legal custody of Leo. He did not ask for Amelia's parental rights to be terminated, but for her visitation to be supervised and conditional upon her completing a comprehensive course of therapy and anger management. He used his wealth not as a weapon, but as a shield to protect his son. He funded the best child psychologist to help Leo process the emotional trauma. He set up a generous but strictly controlled trust for Leo's future, untouchable by anyone. Amelia was forced to confront the stark reality of her situation in a sterile courthouse conference room. Her lawyer laid it out for her in blunt terms. "You can fight this, and you will lose, publicly and humiliatingly. Or you can accept the terms. You can go to therapy, you can learn to be a better parent, and you can have a chance to rebuild a relationship with your son. The choice is yours." Stripped of her wealth, abandoned by her friends, and condemned by her own mother, Amelia had no choice at all. She agreed to the terms. The first supervised visit was a sterile, heartbreaking affair. It took place in a small, neutral-colored room at the Family Services Center, with a court-appointed supervisor watching from the corner. Leo was quiet, clinging to Julian's hand as they entered. Amelia had clearly made an effort. Her hair was neat, her clothes simple. She looked smaller, diminished. She had brought a gift, an expensive-looking remote-controlled car. "Hello, Leo," she said, her voice strained. "I brought you something." Leo looked at the toy, then at his father. He didn't move. "It's okay, buddy," Julian said softly. "You can go say hello to your mom." Leo shuffled forward hesitantly. Amelia knelt down, trying to smile. "Do you like it? We can play with it." "Why did you make me eat from the cat bowl?" Leo asked. The question was not accusatory. It was a simple, honest inquiry from a child who needed to understand. The question struck Amelia with the force of a physical blow. The supervisor in the corner made a note on her pad. Amelia's practiced smile faltered. She looked at her son's clear, questioning eyes, and for the first time she seemed to see him not as an accessory or a reflection of herself, but as a person she had deeply wounded. I don't know, she whispered, the truth of it raw and exposed. It was a horrible thing to do. I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Leo. It was the first genuine apology she had ever offered. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a magic wand that could erase the past, but it was a start, a tiny seed of something real planted in the barren ground of their relationship. Julian watched from the doorway. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep, profound sadness for the wreckage one person's arrogance could create. But as he saw his son tentatively take a step closer to his mother, he also felt a flicker of hope. Redemption, he knew, was a long and difficult road. But for the first time, it seemed that Amelia might be willing to take the first step. The resolution was not about his victory, but about his son's future. A future that might, one day, have room for a mother who had finally learned the meaning of love. In the months that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over their lives. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of the old house, but a peaceful, healing silence. Julian and Leo's life in the penthouse found a gentle rhythm. Mornings were for school and work. Julian had started a small, private consulting firm, taking on only projects that truly inspired him, work that was about creation, not just commerce. Afternoons were for park visits, Lego castles that were praised as architectural marvels, and rocket ship drawings that were hailed as masterpieces of interstellar engineering. Leo began to flourish. The timid, anxious boy who pushed food around his plate was replaced by a confident, inquisitive child who laughed easily and wasn't afraid to make a mess. He was enrolled in a new school where his teachers described him as bright and kind. The child psychologist reported that he was healing, that the foundation of love and security his father was providing was stronger than the scars of the past. Amelia, for her part, stuck to the court's requirements. She attended therapy twice a week. She completed the anger management course. Her supervised visits with Leo slowly became less strained. She stopped bringing expensive gifts and started bringing herself. She learned to listen. She learned to ask Leo about his day, about his friends, about his drawings. She learned to be present. One Saturday, during a visit at the park, she watched as Leo and Julian played a game of catch. There was an easy joy between them that she knew she had never shared with her son. She sat on the bench, no longer the center of attention, but a quiet observer on the periphery. When Julian and Leo came back, flushed and laughing, she didn't try to insert herself. She simply smiled. "He looks happy," she said to Julian, her voice soft. "He is," Julian replied. "You're a good father, Julian," she said. It was a simple statement, free of artifice or manipulation. "I'm trying to be," he said. "You can be a good mother, Amelia. It's not too late." She looked at him, and he saw in her eyes not the arrogant woman he had married, but a person humbled by loss. Someone who was finally beginning to understand that true worth had nothing to do with money or status. It was about what you build, not what you own. It was about the love you give, not the respect you demand. Eleanor, too, found her own path to redemption. She became a regular presence in Leo's life. She took him to the zoo, read him stories, and baked cookies with him in Julian's bright, modern kitchen. She never spoke ill of Amelia. Instead, she offered Leo her unwavering love and support, her actions a quiet atonement for her past silence. She was rebuilding her relationship with her grandson on a new foundation of honesty and presence. The story of Julian Thorne became a quiet legend in certain circles. Not a tale of revenge, but a lesson in integrity. He had possessed immense power and had used it with surgical precision, not to crush, but to correct. He had sought not vengeance, but justice for his son. He had maintained his dignity, his moral high ground, and in doing so had achieved a victory more profound than any financial or social triumph. He had won his son's future. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Julian stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle to life below. Leo was inside, asleep, his dreams no longer haunted by fear, but filled with rocket ships and castles. Julian felt a deep sense of peace. The storm had passed, the demolition was complete, and from the rubble, he had built something beautiful and strong. He had built a home. The central lesson in Julian's story is a powerful one. True strength isn't about how loudly you proclaim your power, but how patiently you live your principles. Arrogance builds walls that eventually become a prison, while integrity builds a foundation that can withstand any storm. Julian's victory wasn't just that he exposed Amelia's cruelty, it was that he did so without sacrificing his own character. He chose the difficult path of patience over the easy path of anger. And in the end, he didn't just win custody of his son, he saved him. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever been in a situation where patience was your greatest weapon? Let us know in the comments below. Your stories and insights are what make this community so special. Thank you for joining us for this story of justice and redemption. If you found it as moving and satisfying as we did, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more content that explores the incredible power of the human spirit. We look forward to seeing you in the next one.